collective let's take a big collective in-breath and then release it out. We'll do that one more time. Dina just shared some very important information with us, and we're going to start recording the conversation at this point moving forward to talk about some of the antidotes that she was sharing at the end of her conversation. The information about Project 2025 is listed publicly. Their plans are there for everyone to see, but this clear-eyed view that there is a standard authoritarian playbook, one that's being operationalized, staffed, and put into real practice, not just in the federal government level, but at the state level and at the local level, I think is incredibly important for us to understand. So the fact that we have amazing leaders here on this call, state legislators, state legislative staff, advocates, funders in this conversation, we want to take a moment to be really clear that there's an ability for us to see this for what it is and not just get stuck in what is an easy response. Let's just beat back all of those bills and then everything will be fine. Because those tactics will continue to move, not just at the federal level. If we win at the federal level, they'll come at the state. We've seen many of these policies already field tested in states or in municipalities. And so what we got to realize is this is a bigger effort to undermine democracy writ large within the United States and globally. Okay, so what's the response? How do we think about it? It is defensive work. It is to beat back those bad bills. But we also have to engage our community in solutioning and building towards a better future. There has to be hope for something, and there has to be belief in democracy. So as we beat back those attacks, we actually have to show how democracy works, and that means putting directly impacted people in the process of having relationships with their elected officials. So I want to say the reason why we come to this, 6 is turning 10 years old this year. We started with the idea that we'll just do policy support work, and that's incredibly important work. But we saw the limits of doing policy work alone. Right. And so we've evolved to say, let's do policy support work, make sure that legislators and movement partners have the resources they need on policy, but they actually have to do the work of democracy, which is why we do the strategic collaboration work. And we know that if we don't do that, the wins we have in state legislative bodies or in municipalities or at the federal level don't feel real in communities. So I want us to be clear. The reason we do this is if our communities can't exercise their rights that we've just won in a state legislative body, and it's not really a win. I want us to take, for example, abortion access. For many people, even with Roe, the Supreme Court case that guaranteed a right to abortion, when that was in place, the right to an abortion was a right in name only in many places. Many folks couldn't access this right, couldn't afford an abortion, or couldn't take off work to go get the care that they needed. And so as we think about how we make the wins real in community, you have to have advancements in policy. People who are directly impacted must know how those rights get enshrined and then how to avail themselves of those rights. And it's a constant process of building up more and more people who understand how to make change in our communities. So I think at 6, what we've looked at is our North Star is, are we materially improving people's lives? And that's where collaborative governance comes in. Collaborative governance is a governance system that reimagines how elected officials, their constituents, and civil society leaders build, shape, and sustain shared power in service of racial, gender, social, and economic justice within a multiracial society. And we attempt to make this the norm among values-aligned state legislators and their partnership with issue advocates and grassroots leaders. Through this practice, we commit to centering the people most impacted by systemic and structural oppression to transform the conditions of power at the state level. And when we do this, we know that we can sustain and secure meaningful racial, gender, social, and economic justice outcomes that are fully realized in the lived experience of these communities, not just a right on paper, but something that's meaningful, understood by people on the ground, and accessible, right? It's a shift from just let's do defense to how do we actually build the world that we want where everyone can thrive. So this isn't theoretical. This has come from our 10 plus years of organizing experience, my own experience as a state legislator, seeing many folks attempt new ways of partnering to counter the rise of authoritarianism by, with, and for their communities. So I'm just going to say we're excited to have this conversation. We know it's weighty, but this is long arc work as much as it's immediate response work. It's both at the same time. We can walk and chew gum. We can do defense work, and we have to have an affirmative response as we move forward. So I'm going to now pass this over to Damaris Allen, Families for Strong Public Schools, who's going to talk a little bit about how this has worked in Florida. Damaris.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Um, so I love that this was brought up in the previous conversation, right? Like the importance of building broad coalition, because that's a lot of the work we have been working on here in Florida. One of the beginnings of this started as we faced a universal voucher bill, but I think it's really important for people to understand that this didn't come out of nowhere. This has been in progress for a long period of time. At first, it was slow growth and then it was rapid growth. So, as we were talking to people about the expansion to universal vouchers, we help them to understand that this has been something that has been progressively happening. This is really important because, as I'm sure you know, universal vouchers did pass. And so it's really important that as we are doing this work, we are reevaluating what a win looks like. And so a win doesn't always look like stopping a bad bill. Sometimes it looks like making it a little bit better, helping people understand the true impacts. And so I want to also share with you some of the work that happened collaboratively around this. So some of the work that was really vital in talking about the impact of universal vouchers came from the good work of the Florida Policy Institute and the Education Law Center. Together they came together to do a report to talk about the cost, the real cost that was going to happen with universal vouchers, and advocates on the ground and as well as the Policy Institute and met with legislators to share with them, this wasn't an undetermined cost as was originally proposed. This was going to be a real cost, and they based their analysis based on Arizona, who had poorly also calculated the impact of universal vouchers. And they were able to say this is going to cost over $4 billion, and it actually is costing that much. In addition to that, we hosted tons of webinars to share with people about the impact that this was going to have. We collaborated both with other states and people in our states because it's really important that people understand the issues and how they are going to impact them. And having real stories from people on the ground was really powerful. So to be able to have Arizona share that people were buying things like paddleboards and canoes and large screen TVs, people weren't shocked when that started happening here, and they understood that that was going to be an impact. Um, we also have we are a statewide organization, but we also have a lot of grassroots groups on the ground that aren't official C3s, but don't have access to all of the resources that we have access to. So we created legislative toolkits to help them so they didn't have to worry about creating these things. We also worked really hard to keep them updated on the progression of the bills, because if you are following bills, it is almost a full-time job during session to make sure that you understand the changes that are happening or if there's a last minute change. So it was really important to us that the average person could speak to how this was going to impact them on a local level and how it would impact their students. And then just simple things like making sure people understood how a bill becomes a law. And so, we created some simple graphics so people could see them going through committee in a simple way. It created opportunities for people to get in touch with legislators. We had call times every Tuesday and Thursday, and things like that. And then we continue to have conversations out in the community about the impacts this is now having in our communities, so that we know that this discussion isn't over, right? We still have to talk about accountability measures. Just because it's passed doesn't mean we have lost or that we don't continue to fight to ensure that we have strong public schools. So we go to community events. We firmly believe that we go to where people are to ensure that they have access to this information. We don't expect people to come to us. And then coordinate with our partners to make sure that this stays in the news and is in front of people and is accessible to see the waste that is happening due to these vouchers. And then we work, you can see some of the partners here that work on public education in Florida. We have come together very strategically, and we are talking about education issues as a whole on a regular basis, and we plan to continue to expand this as time goes on. Education is often not a priority issue for people, but we are seeing that people are more interested in what is happening. the idea that democracy starts locally, I think, is really clear when it comes to school boards and school board elections. And I firmly am a believer that public education is really the cornerstone of democracy. It's a place where students get to get started in this work and things like that. Um, and then the other thing is we don't keep our lessons learned to ourselves. We have worked on pushing back vouchers in other states as well, because people need to hear our story. And so it's so important that we continue to have a collaborative effort in working to create the education system our students deserve. And so it's really important that we share our lessons learned with other states so they don't follow suit, so this doesn't become a national issue. So we have collaborated a lot with Arizona, because they are the other cautionary tale of universal vouchers, and have run op-eds and done work in Kentucky, Tennessee, New Jersey, New Hampshire, Nebraska, and a number of other states. The other thing that was a couple of sessions ago, this session we did a lot of work around the child labor bill, and we really are firm believers in that you find your space where you fit best, right? Like you do the work you where you fit best. So the Policy Institute shared a lot of information and worked with us and some other a number of groups. The student group 6 was involved in this, and there was a broad coalition. And each one of us took our space where we fit best. So we created some advocacy tools, shared it, and this was a great example about how this technically wasn't a public education issue, but it definitely was a public education issue, because if child labor laws were rolled back, it would absolutely impact education. So it was really important that we educated parents, and especially as we have universal vouchers that allow homeschoolers to work as much as they wanted, that would absolutely impact the quality of education and put them in risk. And so as a coalition, students, multiple groups came together and worked. And while that bill did pass, you can see from this graphic, it was not nearly as bad as it could have been. So it's really important that we don't um, write off Florida or other southern states as not winnable. The wins may look different here, but they are still significant. And it's really important that we stick with it, even though it seems difficult, because it things are getting better. The other benefit that's really come from things being difficult is it forces us into a situation where we may have not collaborated before. We are absolutely collaborating now and building strong partnerships. And then it also forces us to look at issues that we may not have looked at before. We have to be really honest about the students who aren't being served in our public schools. So what does a future look like for a public school where we do serve all students, where we do meet the needs of all students? And those are really important conversations to have, that when things are okay, we don't always have, but when things are really challenging, it forces us into a position where we can say, what does the future look like? And we can start to build that future. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it back.
Thank you so much, Damaris. Such clear examples of the threats of attacks on public education, both nationally and in the states, how things are being field tested. But I want to just really highlight what you named, right? It wasn't just we fought against the bill and then lost and went away. No, you actually have engaged for the long term, looking at ways to continually fight back, not just at the state level, but at the local level. How do you activate broader coalitions that are in deep alignment around an affirmative vision for change, and doing that within the public education context and the child labor context? I think this is a notable moment. I just want to like lift it up and shout it from the rooftops, because this is the kind of the depth of organizing we need in our communities. And I will say it's so fundamentally different than the idea that the election is the only intervention point, that election is the only time that people are doing democracy. What you talked about was deep work of getting people who are directly impacted by the public education system, understanding the systems that are being manipulated in real time, and how to respond for the long term. Such a powerful example. Thank you so much. And yes, I'm seeing in the comments, don't sleep on the South. Look at the amazing progress that can happen, and the way that there's relationships building across states where you can say, let's actually push harder in a state like Arizona, or let's push harder in another place because we actually have the lived experience here, right? Those are the kinds of lessons we need to continue to put forward so there's a proactive vision of how things can advance. Next, I'd like to invite in Naida Benitez, Director of Organizing at the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition, who's been working on proactive immigrant policies, keeping undocumented folks safe under the Trump administration and through collaborative governance. Welcome, Naida. Thanks for being here. One second, we are having trouble hearing you. Thanks for your patience all with technical difficulties. We'll have audio as soon as we can get it. Organizing in a digital age.
Can you all hear me? Okay. I don't know what happened. One second. Oh. Okay, I don't know how, but I had issues with my computer. Can you hear me now? Yes?
We can.
Okay.
Great.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. I am gonna do audio on my phone. Thanks for the patience. Hi, everyone. My name is Naida Benitez. Yeah, it's good to be here. And I am the Director of Organizing with the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition. I grew up undocumented in El Paso County, specifically Colorado Springs. And so I immigrated to Colorado in 2001. And at that time, I didn't necessarily realize it until later, but there was a lot of xenophobia in Colorado. Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that today and some of the grassroots campaigns that the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition supported or, was a part of. Could we have the slides up if it's possible?
Yes, so you're a co-host. If you could share your screen.
Okay, let me check. Yeah, okay. I don't see the co-host ability, or sorry, the sharing ability.
Okay, one sec.
No worries. But if not, I could just speak. No worries. Okay. All right. So yeah, thanks all again for the patience. But as I was saying, so I I immigrated to Colorado in 2001. And at the time there was a lot of xenophobia, a lot of anti-immigrant there we are. Thank you. A lot of anti-immigrant sentiment. And in the mid 2000s, also a lot of anti-immigrant policies. And so, and I think Jesse, may remember some of this. But essentially, the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition is a coalition of right now over 70 different organizations made up of like different grassroots groups, nonprofit organizations, and advocates. If we can go to the next slide, please. And so before I begin talking about some of our like some of the grassroots campaigns that we led with our Licenses for All campaign, and also that led to a big data privacy bill that we've helped pass in Colorado. But yeah, I wanted to give the context that even though Colorado is now known as one of the most, well, in my opinion, right, it's known as like a pro-immigrant champion. It wasn't always this way, right? And specifically, it wasn't, it was because of community organizing and the organizing of working class and documented people, advocates, legislators who really cared to listen and to center the voices of directly impacted people, that that we were able to have these like protections for immigrants in our state. But again, it wasn't always like this. In the mid-2000s, Colorado was one of the most anti-immigrant states. Together with Georgia, we were one of the first states, even before Arizona, that passed a Show Me Your Papers law. And essentially that would require law enforcement to report people that they suspected were undocumented, which was a clear display of racial profiling. And yeah, I don't know that many people know that. So it's something I did want to touch on, right? The landscape that we have in Colorado now, and like the strong immigrant protections, were hard fought and won. And something else I wanted to touch on is in the mid-2000s, deportation soared in Colorado. The peak of deportations in Colorado in 2009, I think we had like about 9,040 detainers issued by ICE to sheriffs, which essentially, for folks that don't know, a detainer is where ICE requests from, like a local county jail to hold people longer so that they can go pick them up. And at the time too, the detention center, or the immigration detention center that we have here in Colorado, it increased its capacity to about 1,500 beds. And so part of that, and we can go on to the next slide, it's not coincidental, right? Something I'm going to touch on, and Jesse, feel free to also jump in either, during or after my presentation. But up until 1990, I think it was 1998, immigrants in Colorado had access to driver's licenses regardless of their immigration status. But then law and policy changed, and they no longer had access to those licenses. That resulted in people essentially getting stopped for driving without a license, which resulted in people getting detained and deported. I think it was around this time that a group of undocumented immigrants, directly impacted people from the community, they were called licencias para todos, or licenses for all. They were a small group that really organized to begin pushing and fighting for licenses for all in our state. And at this time, CIRC, joined their fight and helped uplift their stories. But I really want to give credit to that group, because it wasn't even necessarily CIRC, right? It was, people in the community that really had a vested interest in this issue that began organizing. And then CIRC and legislators and other supporters started supporting that group. And so at this time too, even though the fight for licenses began a long time ago, it was a multi-year fight. It took multiple years to be able to pass a driver's licenses bill, the driver's licenses program that we now have today in Colorado. We can go on to the next slide. Okay, and then I know I have limited time, so I'll just briefly go over this. But since then, with community, we have helped pass 5 different bills related to that program to make our driver's licenses program more accessible and equitable. For example, all of our DMVs are required to process this type of license. We've loosened the requirements to make it more accessible to immigrant youth and newcomers. Now we've also, as of this last session in the spring, we lessened the number of years an immigrant has to wait before applying for a driver's license. And we can move on real quick since I know I only have a little bit left. The last thing I'll touch on here is just how, thanks to this program, about 150,000 undocumented immigrants essentially came out of the shadows and in good faith provided their information and data to the Colorado Department of Motor Vehicles, which was a huge win, right? But over time, the community started sharing anecdotes with us um, about how, yeah, they were concerned that ICE was using DMV records. We found out through a Cora request, yeah, and requested some of those records that hundreds of emails had been exchanged between ICE and our local Colorado Department of Motor Vehicles. This was a gross violation of data privacy, and especially when this specific population is already so vulnerable and trusted that like they could be able to share their data without concerns. Yeah, and so because of this, moving on to the next slide, we together with Senator Julie Gonzalez and at the time Representative Gonzalez Gutierrez, we helped introduce SB 21-131. Essentially, this is a data privacy bill, or a bill that strengthened data privacy protections and ensured that state agencies can't share personal identifying information for the purposes of immigration enforcement unless they're required to by law or a court issued subpoena, warrant, or order. And moving on, I think we can go to the last slide since, yeah, I know I'm out of time, but I did want to touch on some of the lessons here. So together, yeah, it was, I just want to touch on how none of this, right, could have been possible. And sorry, if you could go back one more. None of this could have been possible, and then one more, without co-governance or collaborative governance. And for me, what that also means is that there cannot be decisions about like our communities, whether it's people in the public education system, students, teachers, whether it's immigrants, whether it's allies. There can't be decisions about us without us. Community needs to not just have a seat at the table, but they need to be centered at those tables and in those decisions, and be able to have like a process for collaborative decision making with legislators like Jesse. And I think he was a great example of that, as well as like other partners, other advocates. Yeah, and you know, through that collaborative governance, I really think we can not only win but defend our wins, because we know in Colorado we are facing lawsuits to try to rip some of these protections that were hard earned and fought for. And so I'll stop there, since I know we're kind of out of time, but yeah, just wanted to share how we're not, Colorado wasn't always like this pro-immigrant champion, and it was really through community organizing, through building relationships, not just with advocates and partners, right, but the people most directly impacted by the issues we're organizing around, that Colorado is where it's at today, and we have a lot of different protections for our communities now. Thank you.
Thanks, Nida, so much for that perspective, that history, that organizing work. It's incredibly powerful. And I was very fortunate to be a part of it in the early days. Colorado was a very anti-immigrant state, and I got to be a state legislator helping to move those changes side by side with community. Maybe one thing I'd share about that example is that just last year, I got to join a celebration event that had CERC, Licencias para Todos, and others with the DMV actually saying, look what we've done. Over 500,000 people in Colorado have received a license, meaning those families have been able to stay together and not be subjected to deportation. So in the context of the work that Dina was sharing with us, the attacks that we'll see in our families, our communities, people can organize and respond and actually provide durable defense, but it's a long-term game. It took over a decade for over 500,000 people to be protected. And to Nida's point, it started when things were really bad. And so I just want to kind of come to this in both examples with Damaris and with Nida, the idea that we have power now is how we want to end this. You can organize at the city level, you can organize at the state level, you can organize at the federal level. State legislators who are on this call, I want to give you some really quick insights. If you're in a place where just bad things are happening, you can resist. But realize policy might not be your only tool. Maybe you need to be supporting grassroots communities to be centered in decision making, and they build their power and they build their influence. The idea that a bill alone will save us, not how we're going to get through this. For those of you who do have power to move legislation, you can be working with directly impacted communities today to say, how might we resist this onslaught of authoritarian tactics that were outlined by Dina? And at the same time, you can be actively learning from your partners across the country about how to actually advance a proactive vision. So we got two very clear examples, and it is long-term work, and it is about building that kind of durable muscle between legislators and movements for the vision, the future that we're seeking. So I'm going to pause there. Very excited to have these amazing experts on this call, and want to open it up to questions. I